So today we're going to read Socialism Utopian and Scientific by Frederick Engels. You may have heard of him. That's right. I wanted to show you some books. This one and this one. My dad lent me this biography of Engels called The Frock-Coated Communist, which is pretty good. I'm just like a chapter in or something, 2 chapters, and it's just about Engels being like a rich dude as a kid. And I've also got this one, Anti-Düring by Engels. And Socialism Utopian and Scientific is like 3 chapters of this book that was published as a pamphlet. I think here we go. At the request of my friend Paul Lafargue, now representative Lille in the French Chamber of Deputies, I arranged 3 chapters of this book as a pamphlet, and then it's been translated. So yeah, let's jump right on in. This is the English edition introduction from 1892. I think this book was first written in 1880. In the 1880s? Late 1880s? It probably said here, didn't it? Yeah, he translated and published it in 1880. And it was as a pamphlet for workers that they were trying to radicalize or, like, you know, explain some of the underpinnings of socialism in general. Yeah. I've also got my little notes document here. Oh, need to make that bigger. There we go. I don't know if there's going to be all that many notes that we need to take, but we'll see how we go, if there's any like key concepts I want to hang on to. So, let's get started. I'm just going to read like the first couple of paragraphs of this preface, and then we're going to dive into the like main text. So, this present little book is, originally, part of a larger whole. About 1875, Dr. E. Düring, everyone boo every time I say the word Düring, a university lecturer who formerly received fees from his students rather than a wage. Okay, that's interesting. Private docent. At Berlin University, or Docent, I guess in German. Yeah, thank you. It was Purim recently, Jewish festival, and the bad guy in that is called Haman, and every time anyone says that, everyone goes boo, and like shakes their rattles and their noisemakers, clackers, they're sometimes called. Anyway, do that with Düring as well. Suddenly and rather clamorously announced his conversion to socialism and presented the German public not only with an elaborate... Oops, sorry, one sec. I'm just going to make this smaller. We don't really need it, I didn't think. Don't want it covering the text. His conversion to socialism, and presented the German public not only with an elaborate socialist theory, but also with a complete practical plan for the reorganization of society. As a matter of course, he fell foul of his predecessors. Above all, he honored Marx by pouring out upon him the full vials of his wrath. I love Engels' writing. He's such a, like, snarky jerk, especially in this book, The Anti-Düring. Anyway, we'll get to it. But just read all of this in like your most aggressively sarcastic voice possible. This took place about the same time when the 2 sections of the Socialist Party in Germany, Eisenaches and Lassallians, had just effected their fusion at the Goethe Unification Congress, which I imagine is what the critique of the Goethe program is about. I've read some of it. I've got an extract of it in a book somewhere that I got at the Sydney Uni Library book sale with you as well. Anyway. And thus obtained not only an immense increase of strength, but what more, the faculty of employing the whole of the strength against the common enemy. Good. I assume this is also sarcastic, but it sounds good to me. The Socialist Party in Germany was fast becoming a power, but to make it a power, the first condition was that the newly conquered unity should not be imperiled. And Dr. Düring, boo, openly proceeded to form around himself a sect, the nucleus of a future separate party. It thus became necessary to take up the gauntlet thrown down to us and fight out the struggle, whether we liked it or not. This, however, though it might not be an over-difficult, curious phrase, was evidently a long-winded business. As is well known, we Germans are of a terribly ponderous Grundlichkeit, radical profundity or profound radicality, whatever you may like to call it. Whenever any one of us expounds what he considers a new doctrine, he has first to elaborate into an all-compromising system. As usual, Hegel is in the background of this discussion. So this is one of the, like, common, I guess, critiques of Hegel that get made, especially by Marxists, that, like, he's got this all-compromising system. And that he's just, like, deduced everything. Apparently, when Hegel was lecturing as well, people would like ask a question, and he'd say, okay, well, let's start off at first principles, and then like deduce the answer to their question, and then they would ask a different question that was related, and he'd like do the whole thing again. Very annoying. Anyway, he has to prove that both the first principles of logic and the fundamental laws of the universe had existed from all eternity for no other purpose than to ultimately lead to this newly discovered crowning theory. Again, this is making fun of Hegel, but presumably also Dr. Düring, boo. And Dr. Düring, boo, in this respect, was quite up to the national mark. Nothing less than a complete system of philosophy, mental, moral, natural, and historical. A complete system of political economy and socialism. And finally, a critical history of political economy. 3 big volumes in octavo, heavy extrinsically and intrinsically. That's funny. 3 army corps of arguments. Thanks, Bagel. Hey. Sorry, just say. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, don't need that. Here's your companion. And there are people having a nice conversation nearby or something terrible like that, hey? It's no good. Off you go. So, mobilized 3 army corps of arguments mobilized against all previous philosophers and economists in general, and against Marx in particular. In fact, an attempt at a complete revolution in science. These were what I should have to tackle. I had to treat of all and every possible subject, from concepts of time and space to bimetallism. What's bimetallism? A system of allowing the unrestricted currency of 2 metals as legal tender at a fixed ratio to each other. Okay? It's funny how the gold standard is still, like, widely respected in Marx. Yeah. Off you go, Mr. Puppy, go on. Like, they didn't have any concept of fiat currency at this time. From the eternity of matter and motion to the perishable nature of moral ideas. From Darwin's natural selection to the education of youth in a future society. Come on. Anyhow, the systematic comprehensiveness of my opponent gave me the opportunity of developing an... Come on, Mr. Puppy. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, good boy. Developing an opposition to him, and in a more connected form than had previously been done, the views held by Marx and myself on this great variety of subjects. And that's what Wizard of Oz is about, right? Bimetallism? I don't remember, but sounds plausible. The views held by Marx and myself on this great variety of subjects, and that was the principal reason which made me undertake this otherwise ungrateful task. My reply was first published in a series of articles in the Leipzig Vorwärts, the chief organ of the Socialist Party, and later on as a book, Herr Eugen Düring's Umwälzung der Wissenschaft, Mr. E. Düring's Revolution in Science, more commonly known as the Anti-Düring. Yeah, hi Bagel. This pet's from Isabel in particular, hey? A second edition of which appeared in Zurich 1886 at the request of my friend Paul Lafargue, now representative of Lille. This is the bit quoted. Yeah, in the French Chamber of Deputies, I arranged 3 chapters of this book as a pamphlet, which he translated and published in 1880 under the title Socialism Utopic, Socialism Scientific. Sorry, my French is garbage, as they say. From this French text, a Polish and a Spanish edition were prepared. In 1883, our German friends brought out the pamphlet in the original language. Italian, Russian, Danish, Dutch, and Romanian translations. Romanian. Based upon the German text have since been published. Thus, the present English edition, this little book circulates in 10 languages. I'm not aware that any other socialist work, not even our Communist Manifesto or Marx's Capital, has been so often translated. I'm sure that's no longer true. In Germany, it has 4 editions of about 20,000 copies in all. Wow. And then he talks about the appendix, which I don't care about, because we're probably not even going to finish the first chapter. Uses terms from Capital, and he's sort of just like laying out the general issues that he's going to talk about. The history of industrial production, historical materialism, and yeah, this is like, I don't know, just him going on about it. But let's get into chapter 1. History, the role of religion in the English middle class. That's weird. I wonder if the word for the role of religion is the same as the word for history. Curious. When Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, the rising middle class of the towns constituted its revolutionary element. Alright, Engels, I'm gonna let you finish, but I'm gonna stop you right there, or whatever. I can't remember how that meme goes. Remember when that was the worst thing Kanye did? That was Kanye, wasn't it? Anyway. this view that Engels is about to present of like where the bourgeoisie come from is not necessarily well supported by historical evidence. And I'd like to recommend in particular a book called The Origins of Capitalism by Ellen Makesons Wood. Maybe I'll pop that in the notes. It's pretty short, but also pretty dense. Sorry, babe, you're gonna have to hop off. Yes, you're a very good boy. Is it Makesons Wood, I believe. Okay, this is gonna be too big. And she has way more actual, like, concrete evidence than... Yeah, I really liked it. It was recommended to me by sort of, like, prefiguratist friend. But yeah, it was a real banger. It's, like... Yeah, apparently Makesons Wood was, like, part of this whole, like, new genre of Marxism. I think it was called historical Marxism or something, which is funny. Anyway, yeah. But she has a really good critique of this, like, stereotyped view, which I used to subscribe to pretty enthusiastically. Okay. That said, let's continue with Engels. The rising middle class of the towns constituted its revolutionary element. It had conquered a recognized position within medieval feudal organization, but this position also had become too narrow for its expansive power. See later when I play EU4. The development of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, became incompatible with the maintenance of the feudal system. The feudal system, therefore, had to fall. Oops. But the great international center of feudalism was the Roman Catholic Church. It united the whole of feudalized Western Europe, in spite of all internal wars, into one grand political system, opposed as much to the schismatic Greeks as to the Mohammedan countries. Both of those are hilarious old-timey words, schismatic Greeks and the Mohammedans. It had organized its own hierarchy on the feudal model, and lastly, it was itself by far the most powerful feudal lord, holding as it did fully 1/3 of the soil in the Catholic world. Before profane feudalism could be successfully attacked in each country and in detail, this, its sacred central organization, had to be destroyed. Interesting. It's not something that modern Marxists talk about very much, except in, like, I feel like the opposition to the church is either, like, anti-sex abuse or, like, being an atheist or whatever. But, yeah, interesting, that association with feudalism. Which kind of makes sense as well with, like, Protestantism or whatever. Anyway, moreover, parallel with the rise of the middle class went on the great revival of science. Astronomy, mechanics, physics, autonomy, physiology were once again cultivated, and the bourgeoisie, for the development of its industrial production, required a science which ascertained the physical properties of natural objects and the modes of action on the forces of nature. Okay? Don't see why that's necessarily more true for the bourgeoisie than other previous ruling classes, but no worries. Now up to then, science had been the humble handmaid of the church, had not been allowed to overlap the limits set by faith, and for that reason had been no science at all. Science rebelled against the church. The bourgeoisie could not do without science, and therefore had to join in the revolution. It's a little idealist, which is a charge that Engels will be leveling against everyone else in this book. The above, though touching but two of the points where the rising middle class was bound to come into collision with the established religion, will be sufficient to show first that the class most directly interested in the struggle against the pretensions of the Roman Church was the bourgeoisie, and second that every struggle against feudalism at that time had to take on a religious disguise, had to be directed against the church in the first instance. Yeah, interesting. I guess... it's kind of like, I don't know, I'm just trying to, like, see if there's any, like, anything in my life that feels like this or something. I guess maybe, like, the way that the Liberal Party is, like, permanently the bad guy in Australia. Obviously, it's on a much smaller scale, but, like, even when we're, like, telling Labour to get their shit together, it's with the Liberals in the background or something, you know? The spectre of the church haunting feudalism. I don't know, maybe that's not a great example, but if the universities and the traders of the cities started the cry, it was sure to find, and did find, a strong echo in the masses of the country people, the peasants, who everywhere had to struggle for their very existence with their feudal lords, spiritual and temporal. The long fight of the bourgeoisie against feudalism culminated in 3 great decisive battles. The first is what was called the Protestant Reformation in Germany. Yeah, right. The cry raised against the church by Luther, was responding to two insurrections of a political nature. First, that of the lower nobility under Franz von Sickingen, 1523, and then the Great Peasants' War, 1525. Both were defeated, chiefly in consequence of the indecision of the parties most interested, the burghers of the towns, an indecision into the causes of which we cannot enter here. Okay, sure. Couldn't just give me one sentence? Anyway, it's fine. From that moment, the struggle degenerated into a fight between the local princes and the central power, and ended by blotting out Germany for 200 years from the politically active nations of Europe. If my understanding based on video games is correct, this is basically like the Holy Roman Empire turning into Germany. Anyway, not sure about that. The Lutheran Reformation produced a new creed indeed, a religion adapted to absolute monarchy. No sooner were the peasants of northeast Germany converted to Lutheranism than they were freemen reduced to serfs. Interesting, okay. So you're saying Lutheranism was adapted to absolute monarchy? Is that as opposed to, like, Catholic-run feudalism? Like church feudalism? Question mark? Or, like, emperors? I don't really follow the distinction he's making there, but that's fine. Get the general gist. But where Luther failed, Calvin won the day. Calvin's creed was one fit for the boldest of the bourgeoisie of his time. His predestination doctrine was the religious expression of the fact that in the commercial world of competition, success or failure does not depend upon a man's activity or cleverness, but upon circumstances uncontrollable by him. That's such a funny link to draw with Calvinism, but sure. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's a funny link. He's like, they're worshipping the invisible hand of the market, basically. Yeah. It is not him that willeth, or him that runneth. Sorry, it is not of him that willeth or of him that runneth, but of the mercy of unknown superior economic powers. Wow, I feel like that's a line that could come straight out of Unsung. Anyway. And this was especially true at a period of economic revolution, when all old commercial routes and centers were replaced by new ones, when India and America were open to the world, and when even the most sacred economic articles of faith, the value of gold and silver, began to totter and to break down. Calvin's church constitution of God was republicanized. Could the kingdoms of the world remain subject to monarchs, bishops, and lords? Okay. I feel like he's just kind of like repeatedly stating his view rather than actually marshalling evidence in favor of it, but that's fine. While German Lutheranism became a willing tool in the hands of princes, Calvinism founded a republic in Holland, and active republican parties in England, and above all, Scotland. Interesting. Yeah. I don't know about this, like... I don't know. It seems very not historical materialist to be like, oh, it's because Calvinism vibes like capitalism that then they founded communities in these places. It, like, founded republics? I don't know. I don't know enough to say it's not true, but it just seems like a weird mechanism that he's claiming is working. Anyway, in Calvinism, the second great bourgeois upheaval found its doctrine ready, cut, and dried. This upheaval took place in England. That is also what Mason's Wood says. The middle class of the towns brought it on. That is not what she said. And the yeomanry of the country districts fought it out. So I think her claim is actually the yeomans were precisely the people who caused capitalism to eventuate. Or rather, there were landowners who rented out to yeomen, who then rented out to serfs, basically. And it was partly because of the common law, which is often misunderstood by, like, sovereign citizens to mean the law of you and me, of us commoners or something. But no, it just means that the entire of England had one law in common instead of a bunch of, like, regional patchwork ones. Anyway, the landlords rented to yeomen, and so then when the yeomen kind of had to compete for who was making the most money to get the tenders, something like that. Anyway, curiously enough, in all three great bourgeois risings, the peasantry furnishes the army that has to do the fighting. The peasantry is just the class that, the victory once gained, is most surely ruined by the economic consequences of that victory. this is very prescient of the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, in my opinion, which is a critique that, yeah, ultra leftists is the term I think often make, that like the conditions in Russia and China weren't adequately developed for the proletariat to revolt, and that's why the peasants were involved, and that's why they haven't turned into like glorious communist utopias. Sorry, keep banging the desk. But Engels clearly seems aware that that's plausible. Anyway, 100 years after Cromwell, the yeomanry of England had almost disappeared. Anyhow, had it not been for that yeomanry and for the plebeian element in the towns, the bourgeoisie alone would never have fought the matter out to the bitter end. That's especially true of like the French Revolution. The plebeians, the sans-culottes, were vital. Anyway, and would never have brought Charles I to the scaffold. In order to secure even those conquests of the bourgeoisie that were ripe for gathering at the time, the revolution had to be carried considerably further, exactly as in 1793 in France and 1848 in Germany. This seems, in fact, to be one of the laws of the evolution of bourgeois society. Okay, what is the law? In order to secure even those conquests of the bourgeoisie that were ripe for gathering at the time. No, that doesn't seem like it could be a law. That the yeomanry and plebeians have to assist the bourgeoisie? That seems like a useful fact to be aware of. Well, upon this excess of revolutionary activity, there necessarily followed the inevitable reaction which, in its turn, went beyond the point where it might have maintained itself. After a series of oscillations, the new centre of gravity was at last attained and became a new starting point. The grand period of English history, known to respectability under the name of the Great Rebellion and the struggles succeeding it, were brought to a close by the comparatively puny events entitled by liberal historians the Glorious Revolution. Okay, I don't know which either of these are, so I can't really explain that one any further, but that's fine. The new starting point was a compromise between the rising middle class and the ex-feudal landowners. The latter, though called as now the aristocracy, had been long since on the way which led them to become what Louis-Philippe in France became at a much later period, the first bourgeoisie of the kingdom. The first bourgeois of the kingdom, yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of still the case now, right, with existing monarchs in Spain or England or whatever. Fortunately for England, the old feudal barons had killed one another during the War of the Roses. Their successors, though mostly scions of the old families, had been so much out of the direct line of descent that they constituted quite a new body, with habits and tendencies far more bourgeois than feudal. They fully understood the value of money, and at once began to increase their rents by turning hundreds of small farmers out and replacing them with sheep. Henry VIII, while squandering the church lands, created fresh bourgeois landlords by wholesale. What you doing? The innumerable confiscation of estates, regranted to absolute or relative upstarts, and continued during the whole of the 17th century, had the same result. Okay? I think, again, this is what Mixonswood is kind of like going into detail about in her book. Consequently, ever since Henry VIII, the English aristocracy, far from counteracting the development of industrial production, had, on the contrary, sought to indirectly profit thereby, i.e., have investments. And there had always been a section of the great landowners willing, from economic or political reasons, to cooperate with the leading men of the financial and industrial bourgeoisie. Separate groups. The Compromise of 1689 was therefore easily accomplished. The political spoils of Pelfen Place. Pelf? Money, okay. Pelf and Place were left to the great landowning families, provided the economic interests of the financial, manufacturing, and commercial middle class were sufficiently attended to. And these economic interests were at that time powerful enough to determine the general policy of the nation. There might be squabbles about matters of detail, but on the whole, the aristocratic oligarchy knew all too well that its own economic prosperity was irretrievably bound up with that of the industrial and commercial middle class. From that time, the bourgeoisie was a humble but still recognized component of the ruling classes of England. With the rest of them, it was I'm just going to change this shape and size a little bit. Yeah, sensible. Not that I'm using it really, but just to get it out of the way. A component of the had a common interest in keeping in subjection the great working mass of the nation. The merchant or manufacturer himself stood in the position of master, or, as it was lately called, the natural superior to his clerks, his workpeople, his domestic servants. His interest was to get as much and as good work out of them as he could. For this end, they had to be trained to proper submission. He was himself religious. His religion had supplied the standard under which he had fought the kings and the lords. He was not long in discovering the opportunities of this same religion offered him for working upon the minds of his natural inferiors, and making them submissive to the behests of the masters it had pleased God to place over them. In short, the English bourgeoisie now had to take a part in keeping down the lower orders, the great producing mass of the nation, and one of the means employed for that purpose was the influence of religion. I mean, I know they said it in the title, but I forgot how much this book was about religion. Anyway, there was another factor that contributed to strengthen the religious leanings of the bourgeoisie. This was the rise of materialism in England. This new doctrine was not only shocked the pious feelings of the middle class, it announced itself as a philosophy only fit for scholars and cultivated men of the world, in contrast to religion, which was good enough for the uneducated masses, including the bourgeoisie. With Hobbes, it stepped on the stage as a defender of royal prerogative and omnipotence. You can boo Hobbes as well if you want. It called upon absolute monarchy to keep down the puer robustus sed malitosus, robust but malicious boy, okay? To wit, the people, right. Similarly, with the successes of Hobbes, boo, with Bolingbroke, Shaftesbury, etc., the new deistic form of materialism remained an aristocratic, esoteric doctrine, therefore hateful to the middle class for both its religious heresy and its anti-bourgeois political connections. Deistic as in, like, a creator who doesn't intervene? Something like that. This would be the, like, Newtonian universe or whatever. Weird. Okay, anyway. Accordingly, in opposition to the materialism and deism of the aristocracy, those Protestant sects which had furnished the flag and fighting contingent against the Stuarts continued to furnish the main strength of the progressive middle class, and form even today the backbone of the great Liberal Party. Alright, I don't follow the English history well enough there to, like, comment on that, sorry. In the meantime, materialism passed from England to France. Here's a good dumper. Where it met and coalesced with another materialistic school of philosophers, a branch of Cartesianism. So I guess this is going to be Hume and Kant coming up. In France, too, it remained at first an exclusively aristocratic doctrine, but soon its revolutionary character asserted itself. Again, this is really, like, almost explicitly idealist. Very interesting. The French materialists did not limit their criticism to matters of religious belief. They extended it to whatever scientific tradition or political institution they met with. And to prove the claim of their doctrine to universal application, they took the shortest cut and boldly applied it to all subjects of knowledge in the giant work after which they were named, the Encyclopedia. Okay, right, so this is the group called the Encyclopedists or something. I don't know much about them, but there is a podcast called In Our Time on BBC 4, I think? BBC. I think they have an episode called The Encyclopedia, which I will listen to this afternoon. Thus, in one or the other of its two forms, avowed materialism or deism, it became the creed of the whole culture's youth of France. Weirdly phrased, so much so that when the Great Revolution broke out, the doctrine hatched by English royalists gave a theoretical flag to French republicans and terrorists, and furnished the text for the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Great French Revolution was the third uprising of the bourgeoisie, but the first that had entirely cast off the religious cloak, and it was fought out on undisguised political lines. It was the first, too, that really fought up to the destruction of one of the combatants, the aristocracy, and the complete triumph of the other, the bourgeoisie. This is a banger of a sentence. So the English Revolution, I'm pretty sure, the Great Revolution or the Glorious one, I don't remember which, well, maybe both, were fought between, like, ostensibly religious militias, basically. There were, like, the Diggers, I'm pretty sure they were called. In Our Time also has episodes on the Diggers. The Levelers, I think those are related. Anyway, they were kind of like proto-socialist religious groups that I imagine he's going to go into more detail about in the next chapter or something. Anyway. And also that it was the first one that destroyed the aristocracy and that the bourgeoisie won, whereas in England they made these kind of like compromises where the church still had a lot of power. Anyway, in England, the continuity of pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary institutions and the compromise between landlords and capitalists found its expression in the continuity of judicial precedents, right? So they were like, because of the common law, they kind of like navigated the revolution with a shared framework, of a shared legal framework, I think is what it means, and in the religious preservation of the feudal forms of the law, i.e. Anglicanism? Question mark. In France, the revolution constituted a complete breach with the traditions of the past. It cleared out the very last vestiges of feudalism and created in the Code Civil a masterly adaptation of the old Roman law, that almost perfect expression of the juridical relations corresponding to the economic stage called by Marx the production of commodities. Okay, that's weird. Why would the old Roman law... Oh, okay, the production of commodities must mean, like, the Roman economic system. Okay. Roman slavery, I guess, from a look at these Google things briefly. Yeah, the concept of productive labor from the production of commodities to the production of surplus value. Okay, so we're saying the Roman law was like the best version of like pre-bourgeois law or something, which seems unlikely, but that's fine. The adaptation of the old Roman law to modern capitalist conditions, so masterly that this French revolutionary code still serves as a model for reforms of the law of property in all other countries, not excepting England. Let us, however, not forget that if English law continues to express the economic relations of capitalist society in that barbarous feudal language which corresponds to the thing expressed... What? This is baffling. Okay, I think we're getting into some actual philosophy now. Just as English spelling corresponds to English pronunciation, vous écrivez Londres et vous prononcez Constantinople. You write London and you say Constantinople? Voltaire. You write London, you pronounce Constantinople. Yeah. Nice. Hey, my French is better than I thought. Hell yeah. Said a Frenchman. That's a funny way of referring to Voltaire. Okay. The same English law is the only one which has preserved through ages and transmitted to America and the colonies the best part of that old Germanic personal freedom, local self-government, and independence from all interference but that of the law courts, which on the continent has been lost during the period of absolute monarchy, and nowhere been as yet fully recovered. Okay, this has been the first deeply incomprehensible thing that he said. Does anyone in the chat have any thoughts about this? I guess he's saying, like, in the same way that English spelling and pronunciation are, like, deeply disconnected, the way that English law thinks economics works is, like, deeply wrong. And that English law has, like, infected America with this German idea of personal freedom, the, Protestant work ethic or whatever, and, like, what is now classical liberalism, I guess? That, like, pretends the capitalists are equal? I'm not entirely sure of that. Which corresponds to the thing expressed. Okay, yeah. Would love any opinions on that one. To return to our British bourgeois, the French Revolution gave him a splendid opportunity with the help of the continental monarchies to destroy French maritime commerce, to annex French colonies, and to crush the last French pretensions to maritime rivalry. That was one reason why he fought it. Okay. Another was that the ways of this revolution went very much against his grain. Not only its execrable terrorism, but the very attempt to carry bourgeois rule to extremes. What should the British bourgeois do without his aristocracy, that taught him manners such as they were, and invented fashions for him? That furnished officers for the army, which kept order at home, and the navy, which conquered colonial possessions and new markets abroad. That's very funny. But again, this is like, it feels pretty idealistic. I mean, conquering colonial possession. Oops, sorry, bang. Like, the navy is useful, sure, but like, surely this was all also true of the French bourgeoisie? There was indeed a progressive minority of the bourgeoisie, and again, I think Mason's Wood is really the one to turn to on this. There was something a little unsatisfying about her book. Like, she had a pretty good explanation and, like, system, but then she kind of doesn't explain why that happened or something. Anyway, it's been a while since I read it. Maybe I would get it more if I read it again now, but yeah. Anyway, this just seems like, why the British? Because they're British. There was indeed a progressive minority of the bourgeoisie, that minority whose interests were not so well attended to under the Compromise. This section, composed chiefly of the less wealthy middle class, did sympathise with the revolution, but it was powerless in Parliament. Thus, if materialism became the creed of the French Revolution, the God-fearing English bourgeois held all the faster to his religion. Had not the Reign of Terror in Paris proved what was the upshot, if the religious instincts of the masses were lost? The more materialism spread from France to neighbouring countries, and was reinforced by similar doctrinal currents, notably by German philosophy. Again, I think he means, like... Well, Kant was an idealist, but he was also a scientist. And normally when they say German philosophy, they mean the German idealists. Kant, Schelling, Hegel, Schlegel, a couple of others. The more, in fact, materialism and free thought generally became, on the continent, the necessary qualifications of a cultivated man, the more stubbornly the English middle class stuck to its manifold religious creeds. These creeds might differ from one another, but they were, all of them, distinctly religious Christian creeds. Engels probably knew about this pretty first-hand from owning English factories. Though I guess, of course, it was, like, before his time, but not that long before. While the revolution ensured the political triumph of the bourgeoisie in France, in England, Watt, Arkwright, Cartwright, and others initiated an industrial revolution. So I don't know about Arkwright and Cartwright. They're great names to go together. They should be a duo of lawyers. But Watt is the one that, like, the unit of electricity is named after, and I'm pretty sure he invented one of the very early steam engines, the Watt engine. Which is, like, commonly cited as the beginning of the, like, real industrial revolution or whatever. The loom is the other one. Anyway, the wealth of the bourgeoisie increased considerably faster than that of the landed aristocracy. Within the bourgeoisie itself, the financial aristocracy, the bankers and so on, were more and more pushed into the background by the manufacturers. The Compromise of 1689, even after the gradual changes of the parties to it... even after the gradual changes it had undergone in favour of the bourgeoisie, no longer corresponded to the relative positions of the parties to it. The character of these parties, too, had changed. The bourgeoisie of 1830 was very different from that of the preceding century. The political power still left to the aristocracy, and used by them to resist the pretensions of the new industrial bourgeoisie, became incompatible with the new economic interests. A fresh struggle with the aristocracy was necessary. It could only end in the victory of the new economic power. First, the Reform Act was pushed through in spite of all resistance under the impulse of the French Revolution of 1830. It gave to the bourgeoisie a recognised and powerful place in Parliament. Then the repeal of the Corn Laws, a move toward free trade, which I think that was about the British taxing American corn, which is indirectly responsible for, like, all the corn syrup that we have now. Anyway... high fructose corn syrup, which settled once and for all the supremacy of the bourgeoisie, and especially of its most active portion, the manufacturers, over the landed aristocracy. This was the greatest victory of the bourgeoisie. It was, however, also the last it gained on its own exclusive interest. Whatever triumphs it had obtained later on, it had to share with a new social power, first its ally, but soon its rival. The Industrial Revolution had created a class of large manufacturing capitalists, but also a class, and a far more numerous one, of manufacturing workpeople. Okay, this is a really handy hint when you're reading old-timey economic stuff. Manufacturing, as opposed to factoring, means handcraft. So these are people who are, like, doing home orders, or like sewing, or, like, making shoes in, like, by hand, as opposed to using a factory, which is automated. This class gradually increased in numbers, as in a manual or a handbook, or like manual drive, etc. Yeah, manufacture. In proportion to the Industrial Revolution seized upon one branch of manufacture after another, and in the same proportion it increased its power. So there's just like, yeah, they took over the shoemaking business with machines, and then the whatever machines, you know. This power it proved as early as 18... So, again, this is like the bourgeoisie. Yo, Morgan All, what's up? We are reading Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Frederick Engels. We're halfway through chapter 1. I might just go for like another 5-10 minutes reading, and then I'll switch over to games. Yeah, I might take a little break, turn off the stream and come back, but we'll see. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, so he's talking about the transition to capitalism, basically, and how that occurred. Yeah, so I'm not sure specifically, Isabel, but I think, as I say, about another 10 minutes, something like that. I don't know if factoring was ever a real thing. That was me making a distinction about the word, but I guess it was after hand manufacturing stopped existing and it was no longer a relevant distinction, would be my guess. But don't know. Yeah, the bourgeoisie versus the manufacturing work people. Sorry, the manufacturers versus the industrialists. That they were first allies but soon rivals. Makes sense. Okay, this power it proved as early as 1824 by forcing a reluctant parliament to repeal the acts forbidding combinations of workmen, as in unions. During the Reform agitation, the working men constituted the radical wing of the Reform Party, the Act of 1832 having excluded them from the suffrage. They formulated their demands in the People's Charter and constituted themselves in opposition to the great bourgeois anti-Corn Law Party into an independent party, the Chartists, the first working men's party of modern times. Then came the Continental Revolutions of February and March in 1848. This is the French Revolution. I don't know about the French Revolution very much. I read a book about it and immediately all fell out the back of my head as soon as it went in which the working people played such a prominent part, except the word sans culotte, without pants. Great. Played such a prominent part, and at least in Paris, put forward demands that were certainly inadmissible from the point of view of capitalist society. And then came the general reaction. First, the defeat of the Chartists on April 10th, 1848, then the crushing of the Paris working men's insurrection in June of the same year. Oh no, this can't be the French Revolution, of course, this is the Commune? No, this is the actual one. Okay, alright. Yeah, as I say, don't know much about the French Revolution. Then the crushing of the Paris Workingmen's Association in June of the same year, and then the disasters of 1849 in Italy, Hungary, South Germany, and the last victory of Louis Bonaparte over Paris, December the 2nd, 1851. For a time at least, the bugbear of working class pretensions. How much more must he feel that necessity after all these experiences? Regardless of the sneers of his continental compeers, he continued to spend... Sorry, I missed a sentence there. The British bourgeoisie had been convinced before of the necessity of maintaining the common people in a religious mood. How much more so after all of this? Regardless of the sneers of his continental compeers, he continued to spend thousands and tens of thousands, year after year, upon the evangelization of the lower orders. Not content with his own native religious machinery, he appealed to Brother Jonathan, the greatest organizer in existence of religion as a trade. Okay. A sort of Anglo-Christian Uncle Sam. Okay, gotcha. That's funny. So that's like a fictional, mythological character of like a good Christian Brit. The greatest organizer in the existence of religion as a trade. And imported from America revivalism, Moody and Sankey and the like. And finally, I don't know anything about that. He accepted the dangerous aid of the Salvation Army. It's weird how stuff still exists now, but different, you know? Which revives the propaganda of early Christianity, appeals to the poor as the elect, fights capitalism in a religious way, and thus fosters an element of early Christian class antagonism, which one day may become troublesome to the well-to-do people who now find the ready money for it. It seems a law of historical... And again, let's see how that turned out. It seems a law of historical development that the bourgeoisie can in no European country get hold of political power, at least for any length of time, in the same exclusive way in which the feudal aristocracy kept hold of it during the Middle Ages. Even in France, where feudalism was completely extinguished, the bourgeoisie as a whole has held full possession of the government for short periods only. During Louis Philippe's reign, 1830 to 1848, a small portion of the bourgeoisie ruled the kingdom. By far the larger part were excluded from the suffrage by the high qualification, as in you had to be, like, super rich or whatever. Under the Second Republic, 48 to 51, the whole bourgeoisie ruled but for 3 years only. Their incapacity brought on the Second Empire. It is only now in the Third Republic that the bourgeoisie as a whole have kept possession at the helm for more than 20 years, and they're already showing lively signs of decadence. A durable reign of the bourgeoisie possible only in countries like America, has been possible only in countries like America, where feudalism was unknown, and society at the very beginning started from a bourgeois basis. I mean, this is all no longer true, I guess. The American bit is, but like the rest of it. And even in France and America, the successors of the bourgeoisie, the working people, are already knocking at the door. Or are they? In England, the bourgeoisie never held undivided sway. Even the victory of 1832 left the landed aristocracy in almost exclusive possession of the leading government offices. The meekness with which the middle class submitted to this remained inconceivable to me until the great liberal manufacturer, Mr. W.A. Forster, in a public speech, that's just Bagel having a drink in the background, implored the young men of Bradfield to learn French as a means to get on in the world, and quoted from his own experience how sheepish he looked when, as a cabinet minister, he had to move in society where French was at least as necessary as English. The fact was, the English middle class of that time were, as a rule, quite uneducated upstarts, and could not help leaving to the aristocracy those superior government places where other qualifications were required than mere insular narrowness and insular conceit, seasoned by business sharpness. Again, I love how snarky he is. And even in business matters, as a footnote, the conceit of national chauvinism is but a sorry advisor. Up to quite recently, the average English manufacturer considered it derogatory for an Englishman to speak any language but his own, and felt rather proud than otherwise of the fact that poor devils of foreigners settled in England and took off his hands the trouble of disposing of his products abroad. Okay. He never noticed that these foreigners, mostly Germans, thus got command of a very large part of British foreign trade, right, imports and exports, and the direct foreign trade of Englishmen became limited almost entirely to the colonies, China, the United States, and South America. Oh, such a limitation. Nor did he notice that these Germans traded with other Germans abroad who gradually organized a complete network of commercial colonies all over the world. But when Germany, about 40 years ago, seriously began manufacturing for export, the network served her admirably in her transformation. In so short a time, from a corn exporting into a first-rate manufacturing country. Then, about 10 years ago, the British manufacturer got frightened and asked his ambassadors and consuls how it was that he could no longer keep his customers together. The unanimous answer was, you don't learn customers' language, but expect him to speak your own. And 2, you don't even try to suit your customers' wants, habits, and tastes, but expecting to conform to your English ones. Okay? Such an unimportant side note. Thanks, Engels. How much more of this is there? Okay, I reckon we can get to the end. Where are we? Puer robustus. Let's go up from the footnote. Even now, the endless newspaper debates about middle-class education show that the English middle class does not yet consider itself good enough for the best education, and looks to something more modest. Thus, even after the repeal of the Corn Laws, it appeared a matter of course that the men who'd carried the day, the Cobdens, Brights, Fosters, etc., should remain excluded from a share in the official government of the country until 20 years afterwards, a new Reform Act opened to them the door of the cabinet. The English bourgeoisie up to the present day, so deeply penetrated by a sense of their social inferiority that they keep up, at their own expense and that of the nation, an ornamental caste of drones to represent the nation worthily at all state functions, and they consider themselves highly honoured whenever one of themselves is found worthy of admission into the select and privileged body, manufactured, after all, by themselves. It's really funny. Like, this is kind of rings true now with the royal family, or, like, until the Queen died, right? Like, they still kind of do this. The industrial and commercial middle class had, therefore, not yet succeeded in driving the landed aristocracy completely from political power, when another competitor, the working class, appeared on the stage. John Cena theme song plays. The reaction after the Chartist movement and the Continental Revolution, as well as the unparalleled extension of English trade from 1848 to 66, ascribed vulgarly to free trade alone, but due far more to the colossal development of railways, ocean steamers, and means of intercourse generally, tee-hee, had once again driven the working class into the dependency of the Liberal Party, of which they formed in pre-Chartist times the Radical wing. Their claims to the franchise, however, gradually became irresistible, while the Whig leaders of the Liberals funked. Disraeli showed his superiority by making the Tories seize the favourable moment and introduce household suffrage in the boroughs, along with a redistribution of seats. Then followed the ballot. Then, in 1884, the extension of household suffrage to the counties and a fresh redistribution of seats by which the electoral districts were, to some extent, equalised. Okay, so I didn't follow the details of that, but it makes sense. It's just like slowly expanding the vote. All these measures considerably increased the electoral power of the working class, so much so that in at least 150 to 200 constituencies, that class now furnished the majority of the voters. But parliamentary government is a capital school for teaching respect for tradition. This is why I'm not a Republican. If the middle class look with awe and veneration upon what Lord John Manners playfully called our old nobility, oh, that playful remark, the mass of the working people then looked up with respect and deference to what used to be designated as their betters, the middle class. Indeed, the British workman, some 15 years ago, was the model workman, whose respectful regard for the position of his master and whose self-restraining modesty in claiming rights for himself consoled our German economists of the Catheter Socialist School for the incurable communistic and revolutionary tendencies of their own working men at home. It's funny. But the English middle class, good men of business as they are, saw further than their German professors. They had shared their powers, but reluctantly, with the working class. They had learnt, during the Chartist years, what that pure robustus sed malitosus, the people, is capable of. And since that time, they'd been compelled to incorporate the better part of the People's Charter in the statutes of the United Kingdom. Okay, so... Yep, the middle class didn't like the English proles, sure. Checks out. The People's Charter and the statutes of the... right, the People's Charter was the thing that the Chartists were, like, calling for in the statutes of the United Kingdom. Now, if ever, the people must be kept in order by moral means, and the first and foremost of all moral means of action upon the masses is, and remains, religion. Hence the parsons' majorities on the school boards, hence the increasing self-taxation of the bourgeoisie for the support of all sorts of revivalism, from ritualism to the Salvation Army. And now came the triumph of British respectability over the free thought and religious laxity of the continental bourgeoisie. It's a mosquito. We got it. The workmen of France and Germany had become rebellious. They were thoroughly infected with socialism, and for very good reasons were not at all particular as to the legality of the means by which to secure their own ascendancy. Yeah, right on, comrades. The pure robustus here turned from day to day more malitosis. Nothing remained to the French and German bourgeoisie as a last resort but to silently drop their free thought. As a youngster, when seasickness creeps upon him, quietly drops the burning cigar he brought swaggeringly on board. That's so cute. One man's like, "Ooh, these guys are great. Oh, I feel sick." One by one, the scoffers turned pious in outward behaviour, spoke with respect of the church, its dogmas and rites, and even conformed with the latter as far as could not be helped. French bourgeoisie dined meagre on Fridays, and the German ones say out long Protestant sermons in their pews on Sundays. They had come to grief with materialism. Die Religion muss dem Volke erhalten werden. Religion must be kept alive for the people. That was the only and the last means to save society from utter ruin. Unfortunately for themselves, they did not find this out until they had done their level best to break up religion forever. And now it was the turn of the British bourgeoisie to sneer and say, "Why, you fools, I could have told you that 200 years ago." However, I'm afraid neither of the religious stolidity of the British, nor the post-festum conversion of the continental bourgeoisie I am afraid neither the religious stolidity of the British nor the post-festum conversion of the continental bourgeoisie will stem the rising proletarian tide. Got bad news for you there, Frederick. Tradition is a great retarding force. It is the vis inertiae of history. But being merely passive is sure to be broken down. What is vis inertiae? I don't think it matters very much. The force of inertia? The natural resistance of matter. Yeah, okay, it's just the inertia of history. But being merely passive is sure to be broken down, and thus religion will be no lasting safeguard to capitalist society. If our juridical, philosophical, and religious ideas are the more or less remote offshoots of the economical relations prevailing in a given society, and such ideas cannot, in the long run, withstand the effects of a complete change in these relations. Yeah, I mean, this is basically the materialist historical view in one sentence, right? If all of these things are basically offshoots of the economic relations, the mode of production, and so on, they will have to change as the economy changes. And unless we believe in supernatural revelation, we must admit that no religious tenets will ever suffice to prop up a tottering society. Not sure about that. In fact, in England too, the working people have begun to move again. They are, no doubt, shackled by traditions of various kinds. Bourgeois traditions, such as the widespread belief that there can be but two parties, conservatives and liberals, and that the working class must work out its salvation by and through the great Liberal Party. Working men's traditions, inherited from their first tentative efforts at independent action, such as the exclusion from ever so many old trade unions of all applicants who have not gone through a regular apprenticeship, which means the breeding by every such union of its own black legs. Black legs? A person who continues working when fellow workers are on strike. A scab. Okay. Workingmen's traditions. There's like half a sentence missing here, right? Workingmen's traditions, such as the exclusion of all applicants who have not gone through a regular apprenticeship, result in the breeding of scabs. Okay. But for all that, the English working class is moving, as even Professor Brentano has sorrowfully had to report to his brother catheter socialists. I don't know what that thing is, but whatever. It's probably some rival socialist group who sucks as hard as they're doing. It moves, like all things in England, with a slow and measured step, with hesitation here, with more or less unfruitful tentative attempts there. It moves now and then with an overcautious mistrust of the name of socialism, while it gradually absorbs the substance, and the movement spreads and seizes one layer of the workers after another. It has now shaken out of their torpor the unskilled labourers of the East End of London, and we all know what a splendid impulse these fresh forces have given it in return. Yeah, don't we just? And if the pace of the movement is not kept up to the impatience of some people, let them not forget that it is the working class which keeps alive the finest qualities of the English character, and that if a step in advance is once gained in England, it is, as a rule, never lost afterwards. If the sons of the old again, rip the 90s and 2000s. If the sons of the old Chartists, for reasons unexplained above, were not quite up to the mark, the grandsons bid fair to be worthy of their forefathers. Nice. The triumph of the European working class does not depend upon England alone. It can only be secured by the cooperation of at least England, France, and Germany. In both the latter countries, the working class movement is well ahead of England. In Germany, it's even within measurable distance of success. Buon anima. The progress it has there made during the last 25 years is unparalleled. It advances with ever-increasing velocity. If the German middle class have shown themselves lamentably deficient in political capacity, discipline, courage, energy, and perseverance, the German working class have given ample proof of all of these qualities. 400 years ago, Germany was the starting point of the first upheaval of the European middle class. As things are now, is it outside the limits of possibility that Germany will be the scene, too, of the first great victory of the European proletariat? Yeah, the answer is yes, it is outside. Yeah. Unfortunately, there you go. That's chapter 1 of Socialism Utopian and Scientific. Good job, team. It took us almost bang on an hour. How good's that? So maybe we'll do chapter 2 next week. Hopefully it's a similar length.